Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for coming to the Science of Social Relationships Research Center for Group Dynamics speaker series. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Adrienne Wood, who is currently an associate professor of psychology and social psychology at the University of Virginia and the director of the Emotion and Behavior Lab. Dr. Wood received her PhD in 2018 from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in psychology. Her main research interests center on social connections between people and how people establish and form social bonds with others. The interpersonal behaviors that are shared between others, such as shared laughter, that people exchange and reciprocate in building these social connections, and then how all of these behaviors and relationships are embedded within larger social networks and cultural frameworks. She also uses optimal foraging theory to explain choices people make when choosing their social relationships, which she will, of course, talk about today, where we will learn, I'm not going to give it away, about the exploitation trade-offs that people often make. She studies these processes using multiple methods in her research and at multiple levels of analysis. She is the recipient of several notable awards, including an NSF Career Award, a Rising Star Award from the Association of Psychological Science, and has been awarded a John Templeton Foundation grant to study, and this is her title, the daily movement patterns of people who find the world enticing. I would love to know a little bit more about that. She has an impressive list of publications already in her early career, and you can find her work in such high-impact journals such as Emotion, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Affective Science, Perspectives on Psychological Science, and the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. Please join me today in welcoming Dr. Wood, who will be speaking on acquaintances and friends, balancing social exploration and exploitation.
All right. Do I sound good? Okay, I just have to warn you that I have a little bit of a jazz lounge singer quality to me today. I think I'm starting to lose my voice. I heard that happened to Darby Saxby. So my goal today is to just beat Darby Saxby and not have my voice fade at the same rate. Okay, so I'm gonna start my talk the way probably a lot of talks in this series this semester have started, which is by highlighting the fact that people in today's society are very lonely. It was declared a loneliness epidemic. Just one of many statistics that emphasizes and supports this concern. This is a chart of the number of close friends that Americans reported having in 1990 compared to 2021. So 1990 is in blue. And you can see that in the year 1990, close to 1/3 or exactly 1/3 of Americans reported having 10 or more close friends. And in today's decade, it's only about 13% who have that many. And perhaps even more concerning is the other end of this graph, which is the people who report having 0 close friends. It's jumped from just a couple percentage points to 12%. And I imagine this number has only risen since this was happening. 2021 was, before the residual impacts of COVID had maybe affected people's social networks. The number of friends you have matters. We know that any close relationship is good for your well-being, but this graph shows how satisfied people are with their social lives. And we see that there's pretty much a linear relationship where the more close friends you report having, the more satisfied you are, even when we get up to 10 or more friends. So this suggests that while many people might report being quite satisfied with just a couple friends, and maybe that is meeting their social needs, on average, people are happier the more close friends they have. But as I'm going to be focusing on today with my research on talking to strangers and making new friends, it's not just having close friends that's beneficial for us. There's also lots of benefits to interacting with people that we don't know or people that are maybe what we might call weak ties, so acquaintances in our lives. Because of this phenomenon of network homophily, where people tend to be friends with similar others, if you branch out of your close immediate network, you're likelier to encounter diversity, both in terms of the diversity of the people you might interact with, but also in terms of the ideas and information and resources that they could make available to you. So when we interact with people who we don't know very well or we don't know at all, we're likelier to encounter new ideas, new ways of thinking about the world, new information. Also, somewhat surprisingly, strangers and acquaintances, these weak ties, provide rare opportunities for self-disclosure. Some qualitative work by Mario Small, who's a sociologist, suggests that quite often when people have something really kind of personal and private that they need social support for, they don't always turn to their close partners and their close friends like we might think. Sometimes they turn to someone that they don't know very well, like their hairstylist or someone sitting next to them on the bus. And those are the people that they first voice some really vulnerable thing to. And that makes sense for a lot of reasons. Those people don't know the rest of our social circles, so it's a little bit safer. The gossip won't get back to our mom or to our friends. They might also be able to provide a more like kind of neutral third-party perspective on things. So talking to people who aren't our close friends also gives us opportunities to talk about things that maybe we don't even feel comfortable talking about with our close partners. We also, when we interact with another person, take on a little bit of their personality and for a moment become a little bit more like them. So when we interact with different types of people throughout our week, we get to be different versions of ourselves. And there is correlational evidence, at least, to suggest that that yields well-being benefits. So getting to flex your conscientious personality or your sports side or your extroverted side with different people gives you that novelty and variety that tends to boost well-being. And just generally speaking, when you either experimentally force people to talk to strangers or just look at moments when people happen to be talking to strangers, they are surprisingly enjoyable conversations. So I think a lot of us would dread talking to a person that we don't know, but more often than not, it ends up being pretty enjoyable. And of course, strangers are just potential future friends. So if you're never interacting with strangers or acquaintances, you're not going to get yourself opportunities to make new friends. So my lab for like the last 5 years or so has been thinking about this trade-off between how should you balance spending time with close friends who we know yield all these benefits that you've probably been talking about this whole semester, and the benefits that we get from talking to strangers and acquaintances. How should a person balance those two social tasks? And so we've turned to optimal foraging theory, as Brenda mentioned, to help us to clarify our thinking on this. So optimal foraging theory describes how at any given moment in an organism's life, they're faced with a decision to continue to exploit the existing resources available to them. So imagine you're a squirrel and you're always busy looking for acorns. If you decide to exploit at a given moment in time, that means you're going to continue to use this tree to find acorns. So you're going to stick with the tree that you already know about, the tree that is yielding these known resources and rewards. And the other choice that you could always make as an organism is you might choose instead to explore your environment for new other opportunities, so other trees that might have higher caloric acorns, more delicious acorns, or just more acorns. But of course, that is a high risk, high reward proposition because you might get snatched up by a hawk on your way to finding that other tree, or you might not find another tree, or that tree might not have acorns. So this is a trade-off that all organisms are facing, not just with food, but with other search processes. And there's a number of different features of both the individual and the environment that predict when it is more optimal, kind of from a mathematical, rational point of view, to exploit versus explore. So for instance, if the environment is high in threat, like I mentioned the hawks flying around, then it might be safer for you to just stick with the known resource that you already have. But if you know that you perceive your environment to be safe, it might be worth it to you to go explore. If resources are scarce, you should probably stick with the resource you've already found. Whereas if resources that are abundant, it's okay to abandon one resource in search of another potential better one. If you think that there's not much information to be gathered from your environment, either you know everything that's already you need to know, or there's just not much variety in your environment, it's very homogeneous, then maybe there's not much benefit in going out and looking for new resources because you know that nothing is better than what you already have. Whereas if there's lots of new information to be gathered, you should spend some time exploring. If your environment is full of very uniform resources, so all acorns are exactly the same, all acorn trees are exactly the same, once I find one, there's no point in wasting time finding another because they're not going to be better acorns, they're all the same. Whereas if there is variety in like the quality of acorns or the ratio of acorn to branch or whatever, then it might be worthwhile to go explore and make sure that you haven't settled for a suboptimal option. And finally, and I could go on with this list, you could, if you are in a really stable environment, this is kind of similar to the low informational yield idea. If the environment is unchanging, once you've done sufficient exploration, you don't need to continually update your model of the world. It's still the same as it was last week and last year. so you don't need to explore. Whereas if you are in a new environment, you are in a brand new forest, or you were just born into this world, it's worth some time to explore and get a sense of the distribution of resources out there. And that same is true as for if the environment is changing. So I've been talking about acorns for a weird amount of time, considering this is a psychology talk. So let's think now about what if the resource that you are searching for is not acorns, but other people. So we're going to be thinking today about social connection as a resource. And we can think about people as kind of inherently having some reward property to them. People find it intrinsically rewarding to be in the presence of others and to connect with others. And other people yield a multitude of resources that we could think about, in addition to just the pure affective reward of being with other people. So when I talk about social exploitation today, I'm going to be talking about deepening existing social ties. So spending time with a close friend is an example of a more exploitative decision to make with your social time and energy. Whereas social exploration would be doing something like talking to new people, building new ties, networking with acquaintances, anything where you're leaving your kind of immediate comfort zone, your immediate social circle. As we were developing this framework that really just helps to pull together a bunch of existing findings and literature on socializing and spending time with acquaintances versus friends, we developed a self-report measure of social exploitation and exploration tendencies. So just to make it a little bit more concrete, exploitation, one of the items is most of my social interactions feature the same people from week to week, and I tend to just stick with the friends that I have. Whereas our measure of social exploration has items like I like making new friends. Making new friends is more exciting to me than spending time with existing friends. We found that indeed it's a two-factor structure. These things are not perfectly inversely related to each other, so it's not a pure trade-off. There is a negative correlation of like 0.3 to 0.4 between these two scales, so there definitely ends up being in practice a negative relationship, but it is not like a bipolar scale. It's a two-factor scale. And when we get people to self-report on their social exploration and exploitation tendencies, we find that it predicts some things that we would hope they would predict. So self-reported social exploration predicts having a bigger social network. It also predicts, when we do experience sampling, how much time you spend just socializing overall. So what's the likelihood that you're in the presence of other people? And self-reported social exploitation predicts, among other things, spending less time with acquaintances than someone who's low on exploitation, and feeling closer to friends when you are with them. So if I catch you in experience sampling moment saying you're with friends, you report feeling closer to those friends. So there may be deeper ties, the people that you're with. So that's kind of like, construct validity measures that we cared about. Really interestingly, both subscales, when you're controlling for the other, positively predict measures of happiness and well-being. I will say that the relationship is more robust with social exploration than exploitation. And when you look at the bivariate relationship between social exploitation and happiness, sometimes it's a little negative. And that makes sense because explore and exploit are negatively correlated with each other. But when you're controlling for each, both of them seem to be predicting happiness. So some socializing is better than no socializing. And kind of supporting that idea that some is better than nothing. Although, of course, the ideal would perhaps, in my eyes, be to be doing both and investing a lot of time into both forms of social connection. We do find that one strategy can kind of compensate for the other. So we see this with measures of well-being and also here measures of loneliness. So on the x-axis, we have people's self-reported social exploration. And of course, everybody is less lonely the more they report being a social explorer. But that effect is dampened if they are also high on social exploitation. So the people who are saying they really value their close friendships are reporting being less lonely as well. So it's kind of like you can get away with being high in exploitation or high in exploration if you are just caring about things like loneliness. But as we're going to be seeing for the remainder of the talk, I think that there are added benefits that are being underutilized by the average person, at least in today's society. So I'm going to make the case to you that people just generally tend to overexploit their resources. And this is not just true of people, this is organisms more generally. There tends to be a general cognitive bias towards exploitation rather than exploration. This is seen across a range of domains. I think guinea pigs have demonstrated this. Humans have demonstrated it. We've demonstrated it in dating choices. So people tend to stop searching prematurely for a mate. More recently, Samantha Joel has shown that people, once they get into a relationship, have a really hard time leaving that relationship. So there's kind of this progression bias where we tend to overexploit within our romantic relationships. So I'm going to make a case that we should care about getting people to be better connected more generally, because we know how important this is for their well-being and their physical and mental health. But we should also be emphasizing not just close friendship, but also interactions with acquaintances and strangers, because I think this is a bias that we have just generally, is to play it safe and exploit at the expense of exploring. And I think this is especially problematic in contexts where exploration is kind of the rational strategy according to optimal foraging theory. So just to mention two environments in which that might be true, an environment that's high in relational mobility, which describes the United States. It is easier here than in other cultures to make new friends, form new relationships, but also lose relationships. So when you have such an unstable, changing social network, you need to always be bringing in new potential friends in the form of acquaintances and talking to strangers, because the friends you have might not be there in a couple years from now, just due to the natural kind of turmoil of our relationships. So you need to always be like on the market, so to speak, for new friends. And the other context that will come up repeatedly in my research today is when you're in a novel context. We know that emphasizing exploration is adaptive when you are new to an environment. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the consequences, or the correlates, I should say, of social exploration, both at a social gathering, so kind of in a snapshot of people's social behavior, and then in a more protracted experience sampling study over the course of a semester. I'll then talk about one interpersonal barrier to social exploration, which is perceiving yourself to be dissimilar to others. We know that similarity matters a lot for connection. So if you perceive yourself to be different from a social partner or different from the community in which you find yourself, that could be a barrier to socially exploring and interacting with and connecting with strangers and acquaintances. And then I will talk for however much time I have available about a cognitive barrier that we've been really interested in lately to social exploration, which is metaperceptual biases. In other words, biases about how you think other people think about you. If I lost you with that sentence, we'll get back to it. All right, let's get started though with the correlates, the behavioral correlates and social network outcomes of socially exploring. So this was work I did during my postdoc at Dartmouth, and Caitlin Lee, a graduate student of Talia Wheatley, is really leading the charge with the actual data here. What we did was we recorded a cocktail mixer party during the orientation week for the MBA students at Dartmouth. So all these 280 or so MBA students had just arrived, and we put to their new program, they're networking with each other for the first time, and we put GoPros on the ceiling of this massive atrium where they were having a little happy hour with cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. And we unobtrusively recorded them over the course of this 2-hour event. Here's their little dots. So what Caitlin did was develop a little algorithm, a little GUI for interacting and coding and tracking the people as they moved about. This is obviously very sped up. As they moved about, and the color indicates which cluster of conversation they are interacting, like which conversation cluster they are a part of at any given moment. And so you can see that some people are staying still for the entire party and they're just talking to like the same partners, and some people are moving around. You might call them social butterflies. And we then, a couple months later, got a complete sociocentric network of all 280 or so students and quantified how central each of those students were to their social network a couple months later. And that allowed us to ask, what are the network consequences, the more downstream consequences for your social network of doing something like being a social butterfly at a party? Does talking to more people predict being more central to this network and having greater connectedness? And this is what we found. So this is the x-axis is how many distinct conversation clusters you joined over the course of the party, and then the y-axis is your network connectedness, which is a principal component of several different network centrality measures I could talk to you about later. So we do find that people who put the effort in to socially explore in this brand new networking environment ended up being well connected later. So that suggests, and it's a very obvious kind of finding, but we need those in psychology sometimes, it suggests that putting in the effort, ultimately, like, and exploring early leads to exploitation later. You have a network of actual friends later if initially you explored. We then looked at how people just spontaneously socialize, not in a single social mixer, but over the course of an entire semester. So we tracked close to 400 first-year students. These are now undergraduate students. And we caught them at 2 different time points in their first semester. So first we tracked them for a 2-week period in September, right when they've arrived at their new college. And for those 2 weeks, they were doing experience sampling questions. So 3 times a day, they told us what type of person they were with. Were they with a friend, an acquaintance? Were they around other people but not interacting? How they were feeling, different measure, not only their affect, their mood, but also how interested they were in what they were doing, how typical this activity was for them, how safe they felt. And then we were tracking their geolocation passively using their phones. And then at the end of that 2-week period in September, they then took a survey where they filled out a bunch of trait measures, and they also self-reported their social networks. And then we repeated that whole process later in November when their social networks are presumably starting to kind of calcify and get settled. And as you can imagine, as probably many of you experienced, you end up with a lot of variables. And this was a very exploratory study. I like to practice what I preach and explore first, and then we can exploit and do more confirmatory research later. But we were just really interested in, like, what patterns would emerge from the data. And so to take advantage of the fact, or just deal with the fact that we had so many different variables that might all be correlated with each other, and some of them are slightly conceptually redundant with each other, we decided to do a series of longitudinal psychometric networks, where we basically just allow all variables to predict all other variables and capture both contemporaneous relationships between the variables, and then also the lagged relationships. So at one time point, predicting all the variables at the next time point, including autocorrelation parameters. And we did this not only moment to moment, so every time we measure you with experience sampling questions, which self-report and location-based variables are correlated with each other, but also day to day. So if you on a particular day spend more time with other people, what does that predict about your next day, how you feel or how you act? And then we also did it wave to wave. So how does your behavior summarized over wave 1 predict your behavior and your outcomes at wave 2? And then just to make it a little more complicated, because I never want my students to graduate, we also had all of those variables interacting with a parameter that represented which wave we were in. Because we were really curious about whether some of these relationships between variables change with time. So maybe some things are more adaptive and predict more outcomes at time 1 when you're new to the environment, but maybe those relationships change over time. So we have those relationships, and I know you can't read these and I don't want you to read them. That's just to show you how much data we have. But just to give you an example of what one of those wave interaction effects might look like. Here we have affect. So in a given moment, what is your mood on the x-axis? And then on the y-axis, we have whether you're with friends or not. And we see that at wave 1, there's this really strong relationship. That's that light dotted line. The cold is getting into my brain as well as my throat. So that relationship is very strong. You're happier when you're with friends, but that relationship weakens at wave 2. So later in the semester, the student's happiness doesn't seem to be quite so dependent on whether they're with friends or not. Another way of framing it is perhaps even if they're in a bad mood, they're okay being around their friends. They don't feel this need to kind of retreat socially. Okay. So what are some findings? And as you saw, there's like 5,000 model estimates from these models. So I'm just going to cherry pick a couple highlights. We're still trying to make sense of the big picture and how to frame this for a paper. But what are some correlates of being with friends versus being with acquaintances? Well, there were a lot of things that they actually had in common, which I think is really interesting. So in the moment, if you were reported being with friends or being with acquaintances, you also reported being in a better mood and being more interested in what you were doing, which is really good news for people who care about social connection. Also similar across the 2 types of social interactions, you are likelier to be visiting uncommon places, so places that are more unusual for you, like you're going outside of your usual routine more if you're with other people. You also do have greater location entropy, which is our measure of like how many different places you went to in a given day. So on days when you socialize more, you're just like going out and going to more different places. And then you're also likelier to report doing, so this is self-report, doing less typical activities, so doing things that you perceive to be outside of your own norm. The things that were different, though, are this relationship did not emerge for being with friends, but when we looked at the association in these psychometric models where everything is being controlled for, we find that spending time with acquaintances is correlated with greater trait level happiness. So this is from Shige Oishi's Good Life Scale. It's just kind of your overall hedonic evaluation of your life. We also find, this is where the trade-off, we're always seeing trade-offs with these things. While spending time with acquaintances is associated with greater trait level happiness, it's also associated with in the moment feeling less safe. Makes a lot of sense, right? It's a high risk, high reward thing. You're outside of your comfort zone, you're with people you don't know that well. Ultimately, it's gonna be associated with happiness, but in the moment, it can be it's kind of an exciting feeling of being happier, that better mood, but being a little bit nervous at the same time. And people who spend more time with their acquaintances end up having less dense networks. So their friends are less likely to all know each other and to all be friends with each other, presumably because when you're spending more time with acquaintances, you're making friends in kind of unexpected ways, not just through mutual ties. So you end up with a more diversified, you're more of a social broker in the network. What changed over the course of the semester? A lot of things. Don't try to look at the variables in this, just look at how fancy our data is. I'm gonna pull out 2 themes out of many possible themes that I could highlight. And I acknowledge that these are a little bit cherry-picked to fit the explore-exploit framework, but I think they're really interesting and set potential future questions in motion. So one kind of trend is that initial exploration maybe sets the stage for later exploitation. So people who spent more time with acquaintances in wave 1 spent more time with friends in wave 2, which makes so much intuitive sense. The people that become your friends started out as acquaintances. I really like this one. People who reported having a larger network at wave 1, just having more friends at wave 1, had closer friendships on average at wave 2. So it's not inevitable that if you spread yourself thin and have lots of friends, you're going to have more shallow friendships later on. I think what you could be doing is in the first semester at college, you try out lots of potential people, you hang out with lots of different acquaintances, you maybe report them as being friends, and then as time goes on, you start to settle into the exploitation phase and get close to those friends. And then one other thing that changed from wave 1 to wave 2 is when people were with friends, they were in places that we measured them being at for longer. So you're doing less of the getting coffee with someone for half an hour and more maybe spending the day studying with the friend or just being around them for hours at a time. So there's something maybe, it feels a little bit like a shift towards exploiting the friends you have and really kind of having deep quality time with them. Another really interesting idea that is emerging from some of our data is that daily routines build networks. So I've been making the case for exploration, but I don't think just pure exploration is a good idea if you're trying to build a social network, because you're gonna encounter lots of people who you never see again. And while that could give you little hedonic boosts and maybe make you feel connected to the wider kind of anonymous community, that's not the way to build actual enduring relationships because you're never having repeat interactions. So what we found is that people who visit more places in a day or in the 2-week period, but also people who have more of a routine, meaning today, the places you went to today are probably also the places you go to tomorrow. You're going back to the same coffee shop, or you're going to the same library, you're going to the same cafeteria. Those 2 things both predict having a larger social network. So I think if the advice I would give to a new student is go do lots of things, but stick with them. Don't just try out new clubs or go to little one-off meetups, but instead go to things that are gonna have repeat interactions where you get exposure to the same people repeatedly. And also finally, kind of fitting this idea of routines being beneficial even for something like exploration, which sounds a little paradoxical. Reporting doing more typical activities at wave 1 predicts having a denser network at wave 2. So if you do things that are a bit of a routine for you, it might help you to form one of these healthy, dense social networks where people know each other, which is a kind of a stable social network structure that predicts well-being. Okay, so I know that was a lot that I just threw at you, but if we kind of squint, the takeaway of those first 2 studies is that interacting with acquaintances and visiting many places regularly, having that like rich routine that gets you out of your house, both predict happiness and having more friends. And I'm starting to maybe see a pattern emerging where exploration early leads to exploitation later. So I don't think that this is something where you should just always be doing maximal exploration or maximal exploitation, but you need to be attuned to like the demands of your situation. I'm really excited about the next steps. As I've tried to make it super clear, this is very early stages for this research. We haven't even finished like all these initial analyses. But what we want to do now that we have all this data about how undergraduates are spending their time and how that time spent predicts their actual social networks is we want to try to get a little causality. And so we're developing a digital intervention to help people more optimally balance social exploration and exploitation. So we just got a seed grant to build this app called Well Connected, which will help people map their social networks. Because I think one thing that gets in the way of optimal social networking is like you can't represent your whole network in your head at once. And so just giving people a visual to represent it and to also track how often are they interacting with all of their ties. So this is not like a peer-to-peer networking app. This is just like a private kind of journal goal setting app. So you record who your friends are, who you want to be friends with, and then you keep the little bubbles, their little health levels full by having interactions with those people. And then we will prompt you with empirically supported suggestions for things you might consider doing more, like reaching out to someone that you're interested in becoming friends with. Okay, chugging right along. Let's think now about what are the drawbacks to being a social explorer and going out into your community and trying to talk to a bunch of strangers and people you don't know. Well, we know like one of the most reliable findings in friendship and social networks is that people prefer similar others. So this is super adaptive and rational in my opinion. If similarity is a proxy for the following things. So if you think that someone is similar to you in a bunch of important ways, you're likelier to achieve shared reality with them because you just have like a shared context and cultural knowledge and way of seeing the world that will help you to understand each other better. If you interact with someone who's really similar to you, that makes them more predictable because you can use your own brain as a model for their brain. And so it's going to require less cognitive effort to interact with them. It'll be more fluent. If they have the same values and goals as you, interacting with them will be like interacting with just like a cheerleader who's like, yes, I totally agree with your goals and your view of the world. So it's kind of just validating to interact with people who are similar to you. And one of my kind of pet topics to study is laughter. And I've been finding this pattern repeatedly. It's a correlation between how similar people feel to each other and how much they laugh. Before we get into like testing the causal direction of that a little bit more directly though, let's think about what laughter actually is. So I like to think of laughter in its evolutionary terms as being a play signal that we share with other mammals besides humans. And play signals exist to signal harmless intentions during play. Play is often a kind of violent, aggressive looking behavior. It mimics adult behaviors that would be aggressive and antisocial. So if you have a really clear way to signal to your play partners and to those around you that it is not harmful and in fact it is harmless and pretend, then that will allow you to engage in these really adaptive functional play behaviors that help you prepare for adulthood. Of course, play doesn't just go away when we're adults, hopefully. And laughter is a human play signal. Allows us to signal that we have benign intentions towards each other, even if we do something like be sarcastic or tease each other. It's a way to signal that we are meaning no harm. And if we are talking about something else that's not about each other, it's a way to signal that we have a shared understanding of benign violation. It's when you look at how much people are laughing with each other, you can use it to predict whether they are friends or strangers. So friends engage in more shared laughter than strangers. And as we know from Tatum's work, shared laughter among people who just met predicts their likelihood of becoming friends later. So laughter is this very promising kind of watermark of potential or existing friendship. And I think that a major reason is that it's correlated with perceived similarity. So from the existing work, it kind of seemed unclear whether people who feel similar to each other laugh more or whether laughter makes people feel more similar. And I felt like both were very viable predictions. So that's what we wanted to look at by measuring in real social interactions, perceived similarity at one time point, and then we measure their laughter, and then we see whether that laughter or lack thereof predicts their subsequent feelings of similarity. So this is work by my graduate student, Serena Chadha. She brought pairs of friends into the lab. And so here we have these two friends and then these two friends. And so it was two pairs at the same time, and the friends had conversations with each other. They then had a conversation with a member of the other dyad. So we have a friend's conversation and a stranger's conversation for all of our participants. And Serena and a team of RAs quantified the amount of laughter during these conversations. And as I mentioned, the participants reported how much they perceived themselves to be similar to their partners before the conversation and then again after the conversation. And this was using both a global measure, perceived similarity, and also perceived similarity on a range of things like demographics, hobbies, values, personality. And so we ended up just kind of calculating a single factor. If you care about which one was the most important, it seems like perceived personality similarity was the most important of the things we measured. So a couple findings just right off the bat. Friends, and like validating every study that's ever been done on this, friends laugh more than strangers. That was a relief to see. But what was really interesting was we replicated other people's and our own finding that participants who feel more similar at baseline laugh more. So if I feel similar to you, I'm likelier to laugh. But what was really cool is when we allowed my perceptions of similarity to interact with your perceptions of similarity, either of them led to me laughing more. So not only does me perceiving us to be similar, but also you perceiving us to be similar make me laugh. So this solid dark line is having a partner who perceives you to be really similar, and you see that you still laugh more, even if you're at the low end of perceiving similarity, if that makes sense. So somehow you believing us to be similar brings laughter out in me. But we did not find that the more you laugh during the conversation, that didn't predict any subsequent changes in perceived similarity. So of course, this is not really causality, this is still correlational, but it does make a stronger case for laughter reflecting perceived similarity rather than giving rise to. Why is that? Well, I think humor is extremely culturally and socially and temporally specific. It's like something that it's a trend that changes faster than almost anything else. And so you're not gonna like laugh or engage in humorous play with someone if you feel like they're not gonna get you. So I think that a belief of similarity is almost like a necessary precondition to taking the risk of being silly with someone, because you might accidentally offend them or confuse them. And similarity, as I mentioned earlier, implies shared reality, a fluency of interaction, and a feeling of social safety. We feel safer around people who are similar to us. And those are all kind of preconditions for engaging in play. Animals don't play if they feel unsafe or if they feel like their play won't be understood by another animal. Okay, one other study about dissimilarity as a barrier to interaction. So we see that if you feel dissimilar to an individual partner, you're gonna laugh less with them. And as we know from Tatum and others' work, laughter does kind of maybe serve as a barometer for who we want to pursue relationships with in the future. But also, if you are dissimilar from the larger community, that might result in you being less connected to the community as a whole. So this is another study by Serena. And I'm actually gonna like kind of skim through, I'm not gonna go into some of the details on this, just for the sake of time, but this was again looking at the Dartmouth MBA students, and their networks, those complete sociocentric networks, are taken every single year by our collaborators. And so we had 8 cohorts of MBA students, and that included about 450 international students. And so that gave us an opportunity to ask, how does the degree to which you're culturally dissimilar from the majority community predict your ability to connect with them? And so here's one cohort's network. And we used a measure of cultural distance that was developed by Muthu Krishna. Happy to talk more about that later. But basically, we can just quantify the degree to which each of the students' home nations are culturally dissimilar from the US. And just ignore the interaction right now and look at the main effect. We see that students from more culturally dissimilar community or nations are less central to those social networks of their mostly American peers. So that suggests that indeed being more dissimilar makes you kind of marginalized. But like, we were really interested in what exactly are their peers potentially picking up on that is leading to them being marginalized and having a hard time connecting. So it just so happened, conveniently for us, that the students all did this very MBA style thing of rating themselves and some of their teammates. They were all on these little like group project teams. So they rated themselves and their teammates on a bunch of different emotional and social competency inventories that are very specific to a US context. They're very much about US values of like leadership and independence and being extroverted. So they're very culturally normative, which is kind of a strength for us because it's basically a measure of how much do you fit into our American MBA culture? So being higher on this competence is not really a measure of pure competence, in my opinion. It's a measure of Americanness. Like, how much do you belong as an MBA at this business school? And so what we find is that international students whose cultures were more different from the US had worse social network positions. That's what I already showed you, that effect from X to Y. And when we did a simultaneous mediation analysis with the peer-reported competence and the self-reported competence, so how competent do I think I am versus how competent do my peers think I am, it was peer-reported competence that partially mediated this relationship. So it seems like if your peers think of you as being less of an American leader, less of an American team player, that is why you being culturally distant is resulting in you being less connected. But the good news-ish, because I know that's kind of a depressing finding, is that it still all comes back to perceptions. If your peers perceived you as being competent by American standards, you partly overcame this kind of just main effect of cultural dissimilarity. So even if you're from a place that is by other measures culturally dissimilar from the US, if your peers, so if you're the green line, that's peers rating you as one standard deviation above the average on emotional and social competence, if they find you to be fitting American standards, you actually can become more socially connected. And the effect of cultural distance almost goes away. So students from culturally different cultures different from the US could become well connected if their peers perceive them as competent. So once again, it's all about perceptions. And I like to, this is not my take home point from this, but I just like to say that the message of this is not that international students need to assimilate ASAP. The message is that their peers and the American host community needs to redefine their understanding of what it means to be competent and perhaps find other ways of perceiving them to be similar. So interpersonal dissimilarity is an inevitable barrier to connection. It's one of the kind of consequences or costs of socially exploring. But the opportunity that keeps arising in our data, and we find this in other measures as well, that repeatedly, and other people have shown this, we're not the first to show this, it's perceived similarity or perceived dissimilarity that matters more than actual similarity. So I think if we can help people identify, even if you aren't similar in terms of your ethnic background or the native language you speak, there's this one way that you're similar. And if you can get people to focus on that, that is a way to overcome this barrier. Okay. So finally, we're going to talk about our newest line of work, which is a meta-perceptual bias that potentially is getting in the way of people initiating friendships. So there's just a ton of evidence now from conversation and interpersonal perception literature that people underestimate and doubt their own ability to interact with others. So you are sitting there during a dinner with colleagues thinking that you're super awkward and everyone can tell. Whereas meanwhile, they're probably thinking, ooh, she's coming off as really confident or she's super friendly. So researchers find this in any way you could possibly find it. We have this better than average effect in social psychology where people think they're better than the average person in terms of their ability to drive and all these things. But one thing that reliably people underestimate their ability to do or think they're worse than average is things like have conversations and make small talk and maybe give public speeches. So we were interested in adding to the pile of biases, but we were interested in studying it in a domain of social interaction that hasn't yet been examined, which is the transition from being acquaintances to actually being friends. And I think this is a really interesting moment in time. It's the friendship equivalent of asking someone out on a date. It's maybe the most socially risky moment in a relationship, in the sense that, especially in the friendship domain, it's the only time when you have a a likelihood of like really severe rejection until maybe you're like later on a friend could try to break up with you. But it's a really scary time. And so I think it's a really ripe opportunity to be studying biases that might be preventing people from taking that step of asking a friend out for coffee or whatever. So this is work by my second-year grad student, Kai. She crowdsourced and iterated over these vignettes and developed a bunch of friendship initiation vignettes. She's done it for college samples using college student relevant contexts and situations, and also for non-college adults in the community. So here's an example of one. At your neighborhood dog park, you notice someone with a dog that often plays with yours. One day, you two start chatting about your pets. In these vignettes, there's always kind of the implication that you're getting along with this person. Sometimes it's even explicitly stated that like there's mutual liking. Like you get the vibe that they like you. And then we have two conditions, and we've done this as both a between subject and a within subject. In the asker condition, the vignette concludes, one day you ask them if they want to grab a coffee or some other friendship initiation style behavior. In the recipient condition, it's one day they ask you if you want to grab a coffee. And then the question Kai asks is, how will the initiation attempt be perceived by the recipient? So whether you are the recipient or the other imagined person is a recipient, how do you think it will be perceived? And then what will be the consequences? Like first, would this actually happen? Do you think you would actually take this initiative? Would that imaginary person actually take this initiative? And then would the recipient actually accept the invitation, or would they decline it? So she finds again and again across 4 studies now that when you are in the recipient condition, imagining yourself being the one invited, you see the initiator, the other person, as more positive and less negative than when you're the one doing the asking. So it's yet again, people are kind of penalizing themselves and thinking that they will be seen as less positive and more negative. And we found that there's some really interesting relationships between these positivity and negativity ratings and subsequent outcomes, both in terms of like the likelihood of the initiation actually happening, but also in terms of your real social network, at least as you report it. So we found, for instance, that positive meta perceptions, so thinking that other people will see you positively, predicts the number of real world friends you actually have. So these biases, at least correlationally, predict things we care about in people's networks. Really exciting news for everyone. As you get older, these biases get better and they kind of go away. So in our online sample, we had ages from 19 to 78. And this is for the positive trait judgments, so how friendly and warm would people see you. The recipient condition, so this is where you're the one being asked to hang out, they always see it as positive. And then as people, the age is on the x-axis, as people get older, they increasingly see themselves or have meta-perceptual kind of attributions that are as positive as if they were the one being asked. Does that make sense? So like they start to assume that everyone sees their behavior as more positive. So as people get older, this meta-perceptual bias declines. Another layer of cool that I'm very excited about with this project is Kai, in her glorious rigor, did some really careful exploratory graph analyses and factor analyses to look at the structure of these traits. And I haven't mentioned yet where these trait words came from, like how needy and desperate and creepy will the person seem if they make the initiation request? How confident will they seem? How anxious or socially awkward? She crowdsourced these. We've only crowdsourced them from undergraduates, so I think it'd be worthwhile to start over from scratch and crowdsource them from a community sample. But she asked undergraduates like to just name a bunch of traits that or attributions people could make about one of these requests. And she then did some exploratory factor analyses and found again and again that it's really a bifactor structure where you have positive and negative, but then the negatives separate into these 2 subclusters. And if you look closely at what they are, we have anxious, reserved, and socially awkward as one, and then we have needy, pushy, creepy, desperate as the other. These are basically like being overly socially avoidant and being overly socially like assertive or approachy. So it's like a really psychologically natural division. And we care about this, not just because it's always fun to complicate things, but because these 2 negative dimensions predict things in really different ways. So when we throw people's meta-perceptual judgments on these 3 dimensions into a regression predicting, for instance, so how likely is it that initiation attempt would actually happen? God, you guys, I'm getting sick. So how likely is it that intention to initiate would happen. We see that, not surprisingly, the higher you are in thinking that people will perceive you as friendly or confident, the likelier you are to initiate. That makes sense. We see that the more people think of you as desperate and pushy, the less likely you are to initiate. That makes sense. But actually controlling for pushiness, that hesitant one is positively related to initiation. So people think that if they're gonna come off as kind of like socially awkward and anxious, that predicts them being likelier to think that they would actually initiate. We're still trying to like reason through what is going on here. My favorite explanation so far that I wanna pursue is that being socially awkward and anxious is almost like an honest signal of caring about the relationship. Like if someone is nervous when they're asking you to hang out, that is like kind of endearing and suggests that they really care about what you're gonna say. So I'm wondering if maybe people have this like meta-perceptual knowledge that if they come off as awkward, it almost makes like they're almost okay with that, and it almost is a signal that they really care about the initiation. We're still trying to make sense of it. And the way that I think that we will like get clarity is by actually studying these in real interactions. So as people who I've talked to today will not be surprised, we're gonna be doing a round robin study where we actually bring a bunch of strangers in together and have them get to know each other over the course of a semester and see who they're interested in hanging out with and who they want to initiate a friendship with, and ask them how they think they would be perceived if they tried that. And then we'll actually see what happens if they do. So check in with me in like 2 years. So these biased meta-perceptions predict being less likely to imagine initiating a friendship and having fewer friends. And there seems to be this kind of three-dimensional structure to it that was really surprising, but that keeps replicating in every study that we look at it. Okay, so I made it. I don't have my complete sanity, but I do have my voice. So today we talked about social exploration and exploitation. And I'm making the argument that optimal social networking is some combination of deepening existing ties, exploiting, and building new ones. And the balance you need to strike depends on your own individual needs and the current context you're in. So if you're in a new or safe environment, you should engage in more exploration. I also made the assertion that people often underexplore, in part because they have these biased meta-perceptions. They think they're gonna come off as less positive and more negative than perhaps they actually would, and they think that they are worse than other people at it. And perhaps underexploration is also a consequence of this strong homophily tendency that we all have. So I think these biases are actually really exciting opportunities for intervention because they kind of live in your head, and that suggests that you could change them more than if they were like completely structural causes of underexploration. Oh, and okay, thank you, social exploration diagram, for finally showing up. All right, thank you so much for bearing with me, and I'm very happy to take your questions now.
Blake, I saw you and then I saw you. So.
Awesome. Thank you. This was a great talk. I really appreciate the range of methods and sources of data that you're providing because it just kind of is furthering this point. In your kind of exploitation model, I'm wondering how you're thinking about this idea of belonging. There's been a lot of work, especially by Mark Baumeister, who kind of put that concept on the map, so to speak, talking about belonging as a motivation for forming social connection. So I'm wondering if you've thought about any of this, and maybe even if there is work in this space that kind of conceptualizes belonging, especially in your undergraduate samples. It's like if I'm feeling as if I'm a student at this university or community, then maybe I'm more likely to engage with it because I see more long-term benefits in doing so.
Are we good? Yeah. A lot of potential ways I could take this question. One is that Serena has a published study on the perceived similarity issue and finds that perceived similarity to the average UVA student, so what you think they do in terms of like their daily behaviors and stuff, predicts your sense of belonging over and above your actual similarity. So we looked at your actual similarity and what you do compared to our sample and find that it's the perceptions rather more than the actual similarity that matters. So I think that in terms of like the biases or like the cognitions that might impact belonging. That's one really interesting candidate, which is people maybe overestimate how unusual they are within their community, and that would impact belonging. I think that I totally agree with you, because if you think that you don't belong or you're dissimilar from your community, I think that that might inhibit social exploration. For many of the mechanisms that I mentioned of like things that lead to underexploration, I think it makes you feel less safe. I think it makes you think that you're likely to be socially rejected, and maybe you actually are socially rejected because you're being marginalized, like we see with our international students who are more dissimilar. So I think, and like my colleague Sophie Trawalter has this really amazing work looking at where at UVA, which is a very like historic, storied campus, where do students feel comfortable going and where do they actually go, like when it's measured objectively. And students from more marginalized backgrounds like first gen and ethnic and racial minority students go to the like iconic UVA places less. So I think if you don't feel that you belong to a community, you're not gonna go to those like central places, which are probably where a lot of socializing happens. But if we then take the causality in the other direction, I think what's really potentially cool, and I don't have data to speak to this directly, but I think that talking to weak ties is maybe a really cool way to build belonging to a community. Just very like personally, when I moved to Charlottesville and then immediately the pandemic happened, I didn't have those like weak tie interactions with just like strangers, but it slowly started happening, especially like as I bought a house and live in a neighborhood now and like talk to like my neighbor with the dog who like just talks to everyone. And it really, like those little conversations, or even just like seeing the same person at the gym every day or whatever, I think those things bring belonging. So I think that getting people to have more of these quick little small talk conversations with strangers or connecting with acquaintances is a way to, because it starts to like build a prediction in your head that most people around me are safe and most people around me are like kind. It helps you to update your model of like a stranger in this community if you have positive interactions. And I think that's important for belonging. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. This is great. I have a question about the app that you're building. It sounds
Yeah.
cool. So you said that it's like mostly about tracking and sort of like making these things concrete for people, but you also said that there's like goals involved.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about those goals. How many of them, like, are they
Yeah.
coming from the apps? Are they coming from the users? And specifically, I'm interested in like what makes for a good goal.
Yeah.
So I assume there are lots of different ways that
Yeah.
goals can be good. Like, what kind of goals do you think people should have
Yeah.
when using these apps?
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you so much. And I would love to talk to anybody who has ideas for this, because we're like we just got the money. We're going to start January, start building this app. So there's a lot of layers to it. And so the first phase is just going to be like building that visualization side and letting them set their goals, but not giving them any kind of intervention-based like style nudges to achieve those goals. It's more just a way for us to build that first part of the app and then get data from people about like what goals do people set, and then like how people who end up being really happy with their social lives at the end of the tracking period, what does their social network activity look like? Because in the data that we have that I showed you today, we don't know which individual friends they were interacting with. So I would really like to know like how often are people who are really socially satisfied actually checking in with their friends in any way? How often do you have to check in with someone to like have the connectedness go from 10 out of 100 to 50 out of 100? Like we just need that kind of descriptive data to then make recommendations later to future participants. In terms of what goals we're going to let them set, so far I've only come up with like a couple examples, but we're going to be doing participatory design and getting students to tell us what they wish they could see more of in their social lives. But obviously, given the theme of my talk, it's going to be goals of building new friendships, deepening existing friendships. I think it'd be interesting to have some kind of network density goal, like helping create like a community of friends who all know each other could be a type of goal. I'm really open to other suggestions. So I think what we'll probably do, so that the algorithm, like the app needs to be able to then make, the suggestions will be like specific things. It'll be, if I know that you put that you are friends with Tatum, then I'm going to remind you once a week or whatever to check in with Tatum if one of your goals is to deepen your friendship. So we can't have infinite goals that they elect, because they have to then like, we have to have an algorithm that can implement them. But I would love to hear suggestions of other like actionable things to think about.
Thanks so much for the talk. I had a question about the first third, and that's, where do you see institutions fitting into the story? So, you know, if you're a member of a church or Kiwanis or, you know, the kind of bowling alone type thing, like, do you see that as another forest of trees with acorns, or is it increasing the likelihood that I'm meeting people who are similar to me? Like, where do they kind of fit into the story you're telling about exploitation and engagement?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question. I think that that's something in the paper that I assigned to the seminar, which is like our theory paper about social exploration and exploitation. We talk about how like with any behavior, you can describe it at different levels of analysis. So a squirrel could be exploring to find an entirely new tree, or they could be exploring to just find a different branch, or they could be exploring to try a new food type, so you can like get to different levels of analysis, and the same behavior could actually be an instance of exploration or exploitation. So you have to like really carefully define your level of analysis. So to make it more concrete in the social domain, I could be exploiting in the sense of hanging out with the same friend I always hang out with, but maybe we are doing something new together. And so we're actually exploring. So I think that maybe, I haven't really thought about like where would I fit the different places you're going into like our explore exploit framework, but maybe that's like, if you join a new church at a macro level, that's kind of just a major instance of social exploration because it's like opening up this whole new network that you can explore. But I feel like I'm missing part of your question. I wonder if you would elaborate more. Yeah. 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 Yeah, and I think, so I think that like it depends on the level of analysis. Like you could be going to the same church every year, but maybe you sit in a different pew next to a new person and you like shake their hand and you're, the handshaking part of church. I haven't been to church for a really long time, if it isn't obvious. So like I think at some level, even within that community, you could still be exploring versus exploiting. But I love the idea of, this is Putnam's whole thing. Like you mentioned, bowling alone. I love the idea of these kind of predefined communities that you can insert yourself into, and immediately you have like a shared reference point. You know the thing you have in common, since we know that similarity matters so much. Like I know that the thing I have in common with this whole pickleball group is they all love pickleball. So when in doubt, talk about pickleball. Like there's never concern about what are we gonna talk about. And it's this like built-in kind of dense network that you can like slot into, and all of the connections will reinforce each other. So because these people are friends with each other, it's easy for me to then form more stable bonds with them. So I think those are really valuable. And I think college is actually like abundant in these, like fraternities and extracurriculars and classes and stuff. So I'm interested in doing some more of this work in communities where we, like, speaking for myself, we don't have as many of these things. And that was what Robert Putnam was like lamenting, but.
Hi, I was curious how much, if you guys have considered shame as a factor in people's like inclination to try and make new friends and talk to strangers. Personally, the way I view it is like shame, especially if it's like a sort of emotional burden coming from like earlier life or like childhood, could definitely be a huge factor in not only inhibiting or just like how open and willing you are to get to know people, but also like I know that like, I guess at least theoretically speaking, self-compassion is sort of known as like the antithesis of shame. If like self-compassion could be implemented somehow to like see how it affects people's openness and like inclination to like get to know people, I thought that might be interesting, but I don't know, that's just something I thought.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm like kind of desperately searching for interventions that would actually like nudge people, because this is such a difficult societal problem. I think I'm starting some work with Bethany Teachman in clinical at UVA, who studies social anxiety, because social anxiety is just kind of the extreme end of the things that I'm really interested in. And I think that shame is certainly like interwoven into that. And I think that shame is part of those perceptual biases that we're seeing, where it's like you're devaluing yourself. You think other people don't like you as much as you like them. So I think that any intervention that can reduce shame and like boost your kind of global evaluation of your value as a social partner would be really good. I also think that, back to social anxiety, some of this might be most efficiently done through like forms of exposure therapy. Like you get people to do small versions of the thing, like you get them to, and like some work has been done, like these little one-off interventions to get people to talk to their barista or talk to their taxi driver, and they enjoy it. If you can get people, Jillian Sandstrom had people for a week do like a scavenger hunt game where they were like getting rewarded within an app for talking to strangers and taking pictures about it. Like go up and pet someone's dog and start a conversation. And over the course of the week, just 1 week, people became more optimistic about their ability to talk to strangers. So I do think one way to get at it is through like cognitive behavioral therapy style approaches or self-compassion, but another way to get at it is to get people to do it and realize that quite often it's rewarding and rarely do they get socially rejected. yeah, I think that's a really cool direction.
Thank you.
Thanks. Really enjoyed that talk. I have two questions for you. So correct me if I'm wrong, but with optimal foraging theory, it's typically people typically focus on the decision maker unit, right? And if they're thinking about the social environment, there's usually like, oh, these are other resource consumers or something like that. They're not thinking about like what the other social creatures in an environment might think. And so I have a couple of questions related to that aspect that I'm wondering if there are potential, I don't know if downsides is the right word for exploration, but they bring in some potential negative consequences.
Downsides for exploration as like a construct or
Yeah,
as like a behavior?
as a
to do?
behavior.
Yeah, okay.
So would you expect that people who are engaged in more exploration are going to be more motivated to try to control the information that they're providing to others such that they might engage in deception more often? Because they're, it's a risky strategy to be engaged in exploration socially. And so in order to present yourself in the right light, you might be, I don't know, motivated to lie.
I have never thought about deception. I've been talking to people today about some work I'm doing with my postdoc, Chris Welker. He's got some existing work showing that people do kind of change I talked about at the start of the talk, people do kind of shift their personality slightly with their partners, and at the extreme end of like self-monitoring, this is like a little deceptive if you act like you love rugby because you're talking to someone who loves rugby, and that would like eventually come back to bite you probably. I'm not sure that do you think that would not also happen in like close ties? And in fact, maybe there's even more motivation in a tie. Like if you have fewer ties, it's almost like riskier to lose them.
I think it depends on what you're lying about or deceiving people about, right? Because the more frequent interaction is with somebody, the more likely it is they're going to figure.
They're going to catch you, yeah.
Right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. I think one other thing I think there's some kind of indirect evidence that if you're a big social explorer and you're just talking to lots of different types of people, you then are better able, it's kind of like marginal value theorem, you're better able to find the people who will really work with you well. So you don't necessarily have to become best friends with every single person you talk to. It's kind of like when you're dating, you maybe date a ton, but by doing that, you maybe find the person who like is a really good match. So I think one version of exploration is you are very open to people, but you're not desperate to like make them all your best friends. So you don't feel the need to be inauthentic. But because you've talked to so many people, you find the ones who you're really connected to, who have everything in common that you hope that they have in common with. So I think in some ways, a more optimistic take on social exploration is that actually prevents you, like it makes it less necessary that you lie because you can find people who will just kind of like you for who you are.
Okay, let me try one more.
Yeah, go for it.
One more way of
Bringing down
attacking exploration. Yeah, okay, so typically we're thinking about it from the point of view of the decision maker, right? So should I exploit or explore?
Yeah.
But what about the perceptions of the social environment? The other people, are they observing your behavior? So is it the case that exploration might be seen as less authentic, less, more flighty, those kinds of things, and so therefore you get devalued?
Yeah, there is some work to suggest that social brokers are sometimes seen as like less trustworthy because they have so many friends and maybe they're doing so many different things that either they're less reliable. I was talking to Erin about this. Yeah, we were talking about this, and it might be a kind of a culturally specific thing where actually she was talking about in China, it's kind of a red flag if your friends have lots of other friends because it's like, how are you going to manage your commitment to us? Or does that mean that you're not true? The person you're with me, is that not your true self? Kind of I don't know if I'm oversimplifying what we were talking about, but I think that's a total potential drawback. And I think that I don't know how to weigh that with also the benefits that brokers bring to their community. Because if I'm a broker and you're my friend, I can introduce you to my friends and give you all sorts of new information. So those are the people that throw the best parties, or those people who have lots of different friends. So I think that everything is a trade-off, and I'm definitely not making the claim that exploration is inherently good. We see that it makes you feel less safe and all these things. And I think one downside could be that you're seen as a social butterfly in a negative sense. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I had a question about your daily study from the first part with all the variables.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about the finding that it was a lagged wave finding where if you have more dense networks at wave 1, what did it predict?
Larger networks feeling closer?
Yes.
Yeah.
So starting your first year at college is like this really interesting experience. And I was wondering if y'all accounted for how many friendships people have coming in, and
Yeah.
if you think that like sets people up differently to explore or exploit in this context
Yeah.
specifically.
Okay, so I don't think we unfortunately asked them. There's so much that's interesting about this. So I don't think that we asked them, did you know this person before college? And I think that that's very common at UVA for people to have some high school friends or whatever. I also think that another thing that's a problem with asking for like getting closeness scores for your friends is like your definition of friendship might be shifting. Like, I don't know how relative these judgments are. Like if I'm brand new at college and I happen to like make a friend in my hall, maybe I'm like 100 out of 100, they're my best friend ever because like compared to everyone else, they're like my one rock, you know? So it might be that we have shifting thresholds, and so that really complicates all of this. But as to the actual content of your question, we have some new longitudinal study data looking at students who are leaving UVA, graduating, and moving to a new city that's not their hometown. And we find that the most effective networking strategies of the ones we've like asked them about, like we beforehand came up with a list of like things you might do to like make new friends in a new place. The one that best predicts being connected and have like and liking where you are and everything is the friends of friends networking. So if you can be like, oh, my friend from college or my friend from high school knows someone who lives in Cleveland and they set me up and we like got coffee together. That is the most effective strategy that we looked at versus like, you know, meetup apps and things like that. So I think that does like, I totally would buy it that maybe what we're picking up on is, but we're controlling for their wave one feelings of closeness. But yeah, I think that's something we didn't measure and I'm regretting that.
It's okay.
Please forgive me.
Thank you again. That's great.
Down the line. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm curious a little bit to hear more about if you think there's like an objective truth of like optimal exploration versus exploitation.
Yeah.
Like earlier in your talk, you talked about objective measures like 10 plus friends,
Yeah.
people tend to be more satisfied. And would you say that there are these objective, like an outside observer could look at someone and deem how, if they're exploring or exploiting too much or too little,
Yeah.
or does it really just depend on people's own perceptions and feelings, like their own satisfaction?
Yeah.
Which kind of gets at a more broader question in terms of I'm curious about your thoughts about the relative importance or weight of subjective versus objective factors in fostering social connection.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this is super important for us to like tease apart as we try to like formalize this more, is that this is such a subjective resource that it's not like number of calories you're getting per day. So how do we define whether someone is meeting some optimal, benchmark? And I think that we could keep it entirely subjective and just like, find a way to estimate a person's kind of like preferred set point. I think if we based it entirely off of what they say they want, like our social exploitation scale is kind of a measure of what you want. It's like partly it's a little confounded, like tendency, like what do I tend to do, but also what do I want? Like I prefer to stick with my friends type items. And just because you say you prefer to be with your own friends does not mean that that's predicting well-being, because that is negative. Like when it's bivariate, it's sometimes slightly negatively correlated with well-being. So sorry to be prescriptive, but I don't know that people always like know what they need. And I think that like, especially if someone has social anxiety, they might say, oh, I don't want to go to parties. I don't want to like make new friends, but that might be the thing that would like help them the most. So there's a real tension there about like, I think we could use experience sampling or like, our app, like something like that, to actually figure out what is truly making a person happy. Is it the weeks when they do branch out of their comfort zone and do a little exploring? And we could use that to then calibrate. Because I do think not everyone needs 10 friends. I think for some people, like if you don't have the like cognitive capacity to handle that, or you're stressed with work, you actually do need to like pull, it's like kind of Keely Muscatel's ideas about like when you're in an inflammatory state, you need to like be with just your close people. So I think that like for some people, it really would be bad to have 10 friends. And there are findings that like people who have lots of friends sometimes are like more depressed. It's correlation mostly, but having too many friends can make you feel spread too thin. So I think we can find that sweet spot for individuals, maybe using their own data. Yeah, I would love to hear other people's thoughts now.
Hi, I'm curious if you have thoughts about what's driving the age differences in the one study and whether you might find them in your other studies.
Yeah, a lot of my other studies are with just undergrads, so it's a very restricted age range. Yeah, no, definitely not an expert in aging. You know, there's all these like kind of positivity effects, I think, that happen with age where like you just become less neurotic and you start to like focus on more positive things and socio-emotional selectivity theory. So it could just be like a main effect of like becoming more positive. It could also be just you've accumulated more evidence, talking about exposure therapy again. You've had a lifetime of like learning that actually people don't reject you for the most part, and actually it's really rewarding. And people, when you do things that are bold and like you initiate a friendship or you have people over for dinner, they like love it, and it's you know. So it could be that they've actually just like sampled more extensively. It could also be like some like generational effect, but you know, those things are very hard to tease apart. Like it could be that social media is making us all more biased. I don't know. Do you have any hypotheses? Yeah. Oh, so like older people who are new to a place. Ooh, I love that. Yeah, because probably age is a little bit confounded with like how long you've been in a community. And that is maybe you're picturing initiating a friendship with someone that you've been seeing in your new, you know, yeah, that would be fascinating. I love that.
Or retirees, basically, when they retire or whatever, they do go into these new communities where they do not know people.
Yes,
Is that kind of
yeah.
what you're saying? So how do they make their networks? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, now I really want to compare like first year college students to first year retirees. That's so fun.
Anybody else? Oh.
How long is it? And they do, like they actually become close with people? Wait. Yeah, I'm gonna like set up a little participation booth.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Oh, it wasn't the side, sorry. No, I'm more interested because I'm actually.
Oh, there's these month-long world cruises.
Wow. There you go.
I have so many questions. There's no IRBs in international waters.
Hi, I have a question kind of following up on Josh's and Emily's question about the kind of judgments of people who are social butterflies, because that makes me think about the person, situation, fit, where maybe exploration is more positive when there's a norm for social
Yeah.
exploration. That makes me think, do you have data on people in situations where exploration is not what others are doing, kind of transfer students, but you have data on people who just graduated college. Maybe they're joining a company where everyone else already know each other.
Yeah, we don't have really, and like cross-cultural data would be like really good because I'm thinking about like relational mobility, as I talked about there, and like, you know, and as I started the talk with, if you are in an environment where people just don't make new friends very often, then you like repeatedly initiating, like trying to invite people to hang out will be like seen as aggressive and weird. So I do think that there are mismatches between your tendency or your need, like if you're new to a place and you have no friends, so you need to explore, but if that environment is really unfriendly to that, then that'll be a problem for sure. I don't have anything intelligent to say besides, yes, I think that matters.
Hello.
Hi.
I never know how close I should put this. I had an interesting question, or I had a question.
Wait, oh, you had an interesting question.
I had an interesting question. Yeah, I had an interesting
Own
question.
it.
Own it, yeah. I had a question about like the environmental like aspect of your research.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if you ran like that Dartmouth study again, and you had like different levels of like exploiters and like explorers, would like that, does like the environment matter at all? Like if there are more explorers, will there also be like less shoot.
This was so interesting. It melted
Yeah.
your brain.
Like if you have less like people that are like socially explorative, will
Yeah.
you have, like, will that, does the environment matter essentially?
Yeah, I think this is kind
Yeah.
of getting back to the last question where it's
Yeah.
like if you're in an environment where it's just not the norm to be super outgoing with strangers, I think that will be off-putting.
Okay.
It's contagious. Now I've forgotten the second thing I was gonna say. Yeah. Oh, one thing that I was gonna say that I think is really interesting, I wanna like separate out. So when we talk about social brokers, which social brokers are different from social explorers. Social exploration in our framework is like the behavior pattern, and social brokerage is a structural role you're playing in your network. So a social broker is someone who's connecting otherwise disconnected communities. They have lots of different friend groups, and they're kind of like the common denominator. And that's a very useful, important role. There's some drawbacks to it, like you can spread yourself too thin. People might perceive you as being deceptive or false, but it's really beneficial. But I think some people get to that position not by exploring, but by just like being in some institutional role that demands it. Like if you are the secretary of an office, everyone's going through you for stuff. So like you're gonna become the broker, not because of your personality, but because of like structural constraints. Or let's say you're just like an extremely attractive social partner, like you have something that everyone wants. So people come to you. Like I can imagine someone being at that party at Dartmouth and like never moving, and the people just flock to them, and they will become very well connected without like lifting a finger. So I think it's really interesting to think about like, what are the like phenotypes of people who become brokers, and some of them might be explorers and some of them might just be like drawing people to them.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
have one more question,
Yeah.
actually, just like clarification on
Yeah.
like what explorers and like what exploiters want. Like, do explorers want like social like longevity just as much as like exploiters do, or are they more like interested in like kind of the rush of like meeting new people? Like, are the motivations different like in explorers?
I
That
think
makes
part of
sense.
it's a little bit of like it's whatever I say it is kind of thing, where like we could have just framed it differently in the items and then it would be measuring that. The way we put it in our self-report scale was a little bit of like what you thought, like there's some items that are kind of like, I prefer to not have the same social partners over again. It's a little bit of like boredom with your existing partners, but it's also just like loving novelty. So it's, oh, by the way, if you're worried about this just being extroversion, which maybe some of you are, we've shown like discriminant validity. It's correlated with extroversion, of course, but it's like also independently predictive of stuff and not overlapping completely. But yeah, but I think that the thing that we haven't done sufficiently is separate out approach and avoidance motivations for both. Like you could prefer your close friends because you're afraid of strangers, or you could prefer your close friends because you find them extremely rewarding and like you just love every moment with them. And the same can be true for strangers. Like maybe you have an avoidant attachment style or something, and so you can't handle intimacy, so you just seek lots of weak, like kind of superficial friendships, and that's why you're an explorer. Or maybe you love novelty, you love learning about different people, and that's just, you love that kind of excitement, kind of like an openness to experience type. So I think we need to be separating out approach and avoidance in a way that we haven't yet. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, it's almost 5 o'clock, so I think we're gonna call it quits here. But thank you very much for this amazing talk, and thank you everyone for coming.